Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome to our broadcast. We're excited to be broadcasting today. We're having a little bit of technical difficulties grabbing one of our speakers, so I'll be managing that after I do the quick introduction here. So first of all, welcome. My name is Sarah Bulughed. I'm the Community Engagement Manager with the Family and Youth Institute. Tonight we have the webinar titled Mama, I Don't Want Them to Know That I'm Muslim, Raising Kids with Strong Identity. And tonight we're joined by Madiha Tahseen and Amin Aaser from Noor Kid. And we're very excited to have both of these two specialists on the topic. And inshallah, we'll be taking questions via Twitter. And you can tweet your questions to @the FYI_.org, and we'll take your questions there, inshallah. We'll begin with a presentation by Amin, and then we'll move on to a presentation by Madiha, and then we'll have a short period of time for questions and answers. So please save your questions. Please tweet at us with your questions so I can line them up and present them to the speakers as we go. So first of all, I'd like to introduce Noor Kid, and Amin can add to the introduction. So Noor Kid was founded by Amin and his brother Muhammad as a way to inspire American Muslim children to build confidence in their faith. The brothers grew up in Minnesota and lived the experience of the challenges that come with practicing their faith. Their mission in developing Noor Kid, which is a subscription-based children's book series, which was well received widely, mashallah. Their books the subscription to their books have been received in over 25,000 homes across the United States and world. And the whole idea was to inspire their future children and their nieces and nephews to engage with Islamic knowledge, Muslim culture, as well as an integrated part of building their identity here in this country. The characters in the books, which I think are named after them, or maybe not, they're role models, and they role model successful integration for children, as well as making Islamic education more relevant and engaging. And their audience is about 3 to 8-year-old children. The storylines and issues that the characters face are thoughtful and applicable. They stimulate children to use reason, to internalize Islam, and to help build their character. One of the things that I found really interesting about this series of books was that they have questions and prompts for the parents to help actually engage the children in conversation. And so it's not just a children's book; it's actually a family activity. So we're very excited to be joined by Amin tonight to hear him tell his story. But before we do that, I'd like to talk a little bit about the Family and Youth Institute, which is a nonprofit research institute that began almost 10 years ago. And similarly to Noor Kid, the FYI was founded because of the need that was seen in our community. Dr. Samir Ahmed, who was the founder of FYI, was working as a clinical psychologist with the Muslim community and started seeing some patterns that were more pervasive in the community than most people realized. Premarital sex was more pervasive, divorce, drugs, alcohol, and most people didn't realize that these were affecting Muslims as well, as just as much as the broader community, or at least it felt that way. But there was no data to back it up, and so she was inspired. She was inspired to kind of to fit that need, or to meet that need, and it sparked the idea, which now is the Family and Youth Institute. So today it's no longer just a brainchild, but a functioning research and community education institute. We give work on issues such as pre-marriage, youth development, as well as marriage communication, personal development, and we have a team of researchers spanning the United States who are working currently on looking at the experiences of Black Muslim youth, as well as convert Muslim youth, as well as a number of other really interesting research activities that we're getting excited to share. We've translated our research into infographics and videos to make them more accessible and applicable, and we also have webinars such as this for you to enjoy. So inshallah, I'll just do a quick introduction of Amin, and then we'll transition to him. So Amin, like I said before, he's the founder and CEO of Noor Kids, which is a Harvard-supported educational program that seeks to build confidence in the religious identity of young Muslims. Each month, Noor Kids publishes new stories to help children learn and love Islam. And since launching, the numbers have jumped since I looked at their website. Since launching, they've entered over 50,000 homes across 25 countries. So Amin he specializes in identity, self-confidence, and self-esteem among Muslim children in America. He's been featured, mashallah, on NPR, BBC, and the Huffington Post, the Boston Herald, and the Christian Science Monitor, as well as a host of other media outlets. Without further ado, I'd like to transition this over to Amin, and inshallah, we'll hear from you. Thank you so much.
Jazakallah khairan, Sister Sarah, for the wonderful introduction. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wassalatu wassalam ala Sayyidil Mursaleen. Sayyidina Muhammadin wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallama tasliman kathira. So I was 24 years old, and my managing director, Eviano, invites me into his office, and it's after a really tough week. We had just acquired a company. That means we just bought a company. And I'm thinking on this Friday evening that Eviano is about to give me a raise. He closes the door behind himself and he asks me to sit down, and I quickly realize that Eviano is kind of serious. He says, Amin, I'm worried about you. And I said, what are you worried about? And he said, Amin, you're 24 years old. You're on the board of your local mosque. You're writing books for Muslim kids, and you just got back from the Middle East for the second time in 6 months. He says, Amin, I'm worried you're turning into an extremist. Now, the fact of the matter is I wasn't turning into an extremist. It was, something that we joked about. But Eviano, he wasn't like an ordinary guy. He was my mentor. He was someone who was very close to me. And that moment made me reflect on how this happened. Because if you would have asked me when I was 15 or 14 or 13, Amin, would you be on the board of your mosque? Would you be doing any of those things? The answer would have been no. So how did this happen? My story doesn't start with me. It starts actually with my dad. My dad grew up in Karachi, Pakistan. And when he was 12 years old, my dad became an orphan. During Ramadan and when we fast, my mom used to ask us, Amin, do you want 1 egg for dinner or 2 eggs for sahur? She'd say, do you want 1 egg or 2 eggs? And I'd say, Mom, I want 2. And my dad would always remind me. He'd say, Amin, me and my 5 siblings, we'd have to share 2 eggs because we were just that poor. So my dad dreamed of bigger things, and when time came, he applied to every university he could, and alhamdulillah, the University of Chicago let him in. I joke, I say, Dad, I think they may have made an administrative error, but alhamdulillah, he got there. And it was tough. My dad says in the first month after being in the United States of America, he was mugged. He lost everything. He called his older brother in Pakistan, and he cried, and he said, Baijan, brother, I don't think I can do this. And his brother said, why don't you work, see what you can do, stay there for at least a semester. We gave you everything we got. So my dad worked. Taxi driver, my dad did that. Bus boy, my dad did that. He says he bussed dishes for so long that he would start to feel weak, like he'd want to vomit or something like that. But alhamdulillah, he graduated. He graduated with a degree in computer programming, and he ended up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Now, when my dad and mom came to Minneapolis in the 1970s, there was no concept of, Pakistani people. They thought my dad was like a weird kind of Latino. And he wasn't Latino, so it was kind of interesting. My dad says, they used to joke around with him. They'd say, what do you guys do in Pakistan? And my dad would joke around and he'd say, you know how like in America, there's Avis Rent-A-Car? Well, in Pakistan, we have Aaser. Aaser is my last name. Aaser Rent-A-Camel. And people would believe him. They're like, oh, wow, there's like 1 hump or 2 hump. It's like a mid-size or sedan. Now, in Minneapolis in the 1970s, at that time, there were a lot of sort of Indian and Pakistani people who made their way into to Minnesota. And, when there's enough Indian and Pakistani people in an area, they begin to invest into an important institution, something that they hold very dearly, that they, participate in every weekend. Unfortunately, I'm not talking about the masjid. Before there was a masjid, there was actually a Bollywood movie theater. And my dad says that's where they met Muslim people for the first time. And you know, people were discussing where to pray Eid Salah, and my dad ended up encountering with these 7 or 8 other families, and this group of families ended up breaking ground on one of the first masjids here in Minneapolis. Now, this is interesting to me because my dad at that time was 28 years old. That's how old I am now. And so when I talk to my dad and I say, Dad, you know, if someone asked me to invest into building a masjid at 28, I mean, that's a lot of money. I mean, weren't you worried about it? And he said, no, I mean, it was very easy because we had 2 kids at that time. And having kids in this environment made us very concerned because we had to think about, how are our kids going to grow up in this environment? How are they going to be confident as Muslims? We needed a Sunday school. So, alhamdulillah, every Sunday for the first 18 years of my life, I went to Sunday school. Like, what is Hajj, how to perform tawaf, I learned that. What is Zakah, how to calculate Zakah, I learned that. What is Salah, how to perform Salah, I learned that. We even had Arabic. And me, as the Pakistani American kid that I am not very good at Arabic. And my parents would always, you know, want, you know, the best results. So I remember one time, it's not something I'm particularly proud of. There was an Arabic exam in our Sunday school, and I hadn't practiced. And so I actually, oh, Sister Madiha, thank you for joining the call. So I'm just going through my presentation, Sister Madiha, if you want to just go on mute while I'm going through this. I was actually at a really, like, a great part of the story. I was saying, so we were learning Arabic. Arabic was really tough. I had this tough exam. So before this exam, I actually take a Sharpie marker, and I put the Arabic, and, you know, because I cheated on the exam, and alhamdulillah, I passed the exam. But the next day, I had a math class. And as I'm, like, turning in the math paper, and, you know, my teacher sees Arabic on my arm. She says, Amin, what's on your arms? And I was like, she's like, are you cheating in math? And I was like, no, I'm not cheating in math. And she said, Amin, what are you cheating in then? And in front of the whole class, I announced that I was cheating in religion. And everyone laughed, and I felt sort of silly. But what I've described is a pretty standard experience, a super standard experience. And I think that many folks that are coming from immigrant backgrounds can find something in that story that I've shared that they can perhaps relate to. And this is a very standard story that many, you know, immigrants in the United States experience. But of course, it changed on September 11th. I remember when the 2 towers came crashing down, I initially had a great deal of nationalism and pride. I thought to myself, I wanted to be a part of the solution. I remember I started thinking of, you know, instead of thinking about like Harvard or Berkeley or anything like that, I wanted to go to West Point. In my room, I had a poster of a athlete named Chris Carter, who's a wide receiver for the Minnesota Vikings. Go Vikings! You're gonna have a good year, inshallah. But next to that poster, I put up a flag. I put up an American flag because I wanted to be part of the solution. But as the weeks turned into months, what became clear was that my religion wasn't the only institution that was attacked on that day. My religion was as well. They described the men. They were Muslim men coming from Muslim countries with Muslim beards and Islamic intentions. And ever since that day, my religion, Islam, was laced with terrorism. Now, as a kid, only, 12, 13 years old, all you want to do is fit in. And being Muslim didn't help. I remember fasting during the month of Ramadan, and friends would tease me and they'd say, "What, I mean, are you terrorizing your body?" So I stopped telling kids that I was fasting. I said that I was on a diet. I remember my mom used to love coming to my baseball games. She'd sit in the stands and she would cheer. But friends would start to tease me. They'd make fun of my mom because of her headscarf, and as a kid, I didn't know what to do. I began to tell my mom to pick me up 15 minutes after games were already finished because I didn't want anyone to see my mom. I didn't want anyone to know that I was a Muslim because I wanted to fit in. Now, as I went to high school, things didn't get easier. I remember at one point, I wanted to fit in so bad that I bleached my hair blonde. Now, my dad, being the Pakistani man he is, when I came home, he made me shave it off. So it was only for one day, and I tried looking for a picture. I couldn't find one, but I know what happened. I bleached my hair blonde. And then at one point, I was with an acquaintance of mine. His name was Oliver from Denmark, and we were together. And while we were together, Oliver ends up insulting our holy prophet, peace and blessings be on him. And I erupt with anger. I say, Oliver, what are you doing? How could you say that? And he says, Amin, hold on, man. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't realize. Like you were that Muslim anyway. What had occurred to me is that I had tucked Islam into such a corner of my life that many of my friends didn't even realize it was an important part of who I was. Now, when I went to college, my best friend was a guy named Pablo Garcia, a proud Mexican American, and he began to share with me the plight of Latino Americans and African Americans here in the United States of America. Among the things that he shared with me, one of the things that stood out the most was the Kenneth and Mamie Clark experiments of the 1940s. Kenneth and Mamie Clark did something called the Barbie doll experiment. This was a landmark experiment because what it discovered was something called internalized oppression. What they did is they gave little black girls 2 Barbie dolls, and these girls were between the ages of 4 and 8. They'd give them 2 Barbie dolls, a black one and a white one, and they'd first tell these girls to select the one that they identify with, the one that looks like them, and these little black girls would pick up the black one and they'd say, this one looks like me. And then these researchers would ask these girls a battery of questions. They'd say, okay, which one of these is good and which one is evil? Which one is pretty and which one's ugly? These little black girls would pick up the black one and say, this one is ugly. This one is evil. And then they'd pick up the white one and say, this one is good and this one is beautiful. These little girls between the ages of 4 and 8, because they were growing up in such a challenging time, began to see themselves through the eyes of people that had prejudice against them. Now, it's also well recorded that during this period of time, black women would put relaxers in their hair such that their hair would become straightened, and it'd be like a very harsh chemical. And I never put in relaxer in my hair, but I put in bleach blonde dye. What became clear to me was that it wasn't the issue of discrimination against Muslims isn't just about how everyone else sees Muslims. Rather, it's how I, as a Muslim, see myself. It's not an external oppression, but rather one that is internal, one that I have internalized. Now, in 2011, when my niece was born, Asia, for the first time in my life, I thought from the perspective of a parent, and I thought to myself, geez, I don't want Asia to go through the same challenges that I did. I want her to be proud. So we wanted to help solve this problem. How can we make sure that Muslim kids growing up in North America build confidence? So we started doing some research. That research took us to Harvard, to Berkeley, and most recently to San Francisco State University, where we worked with people like, for example, Dr. David Hemphill, who was the dean of the education school at San Francisco State. And I will say that our research around sociology and education, not necessarily from the lens of psychology, which I believe Dr. Madiha may be able to talk a little bit more about. What we did is we looked at other communities that have faced discrimination in America, namely the Black, the Jewish, and Latino communities, and we wanted to figure out what can we learn from these communities such that we can help children build self-confidence and self-esteem. Inshallah, I'm going to talk about a couple of those things, and then hopefully we'll be able to discuss more during the Q&A. When I describe the identity crisis in my story, I talked about something that happened in middle school and high school. And often when we think about like identity crises, I think that's what the plural form would be. we think about middle school and high school. But the reality is, as it turns out, a self-concept, an understanding of who an individual is, in many respects, is formed by the time a child is 8 years old. So one of the first learnings we had was that this idea of identity, it actually forms at a very young age. By the time a child is 8 years old, a strong understanding of who they are has already been established. Now, the metaphor that's used both in secular and actually in Islamic traditions is that of a tree. In Surah Ibrahim, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, what is the example or the metaphor of a good person? He says it's that of a good tree that's roots are strong and deep. His branches go into the skies and bears good fruit. And what's the example of a weak person? That's of a weak tree that's roots have been uprooted. By the time children are 8 years old, a strong understanding of who they are has already been established. And so it's during those ages that we must actually begin thinking about identity. As a little bit of a tangent, I'm just going to try to be cognizant of time as well. So sometimes I can talk a lot, so I'll just be cognizant of time. But one quick tangent is, at Berkeley, there's a researcher who asked a pretty provocative question. She says, what's the purpose of childhood? Because as a species, we as human beings, we're in this period of childhood for a long period of time. An individual is like not actually adding a whole lot of value until maybe they're 14 or 15 years old. Whereas other animals, they reach that period of adulthood quite quickly. And what she found was that during this period of childhood, our brains are actually developing, so our brains are actually becoming bigger. So an astute parent will then ask, like, well, how do I make my kid's brain the biggest? And her answer was kind of interesting. She says it's through play. Play is basically the kid form of experimentation. They like turn on the light and they turn off the light. Like, oh, this is how it works. The more kids play, the more they experiment, the more they learn, the bigger their brains become. And the question is, how can my kid play the most? And it turns out it's through confidence, through love. When a kid feels loved by their parents through physical touch and these types of things, they're then empowered to play because they're confident. But anyways, the first thing I wanted to share was around age. It turns out this idea of identity, it starts very early. Number two, I wanted to talk about role models. It turns out that this definition of role models can actually be quite robust, especially each area of academia, they define role models in a different way. But if I asked you today, who is your role model? Like, think seriously, like, what is the last biography you've read? Who are your role models? When, I'm in the Bay Area and I ask this question, people will say stuff like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk or Stephen Curry. And the reason why is because we can relate to them. The most basic ingredient that an individual has in order to become a role model is that we must be able to relate to them. And by the way, it's part of the human condition to seek out and to have role models. The irony here is that role models are actually the first tool that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala used to teach us as well. But oftentimes we don't take these individuals as role models. Now, the goal here isn't to say that our holy prophets, the noble companions, the holy household are our only role models. Of course, we need role models in other means as well, and role models are a very important tool. But for the purposes of this talk, what I wanted to share is that our holy prophets, the noble companions, the holy household, they actually are role models for us as well. But we begin to actually take them as a role model when we can relate to them. If we don't feel like we can relate to them, we are unable to take them as role models. And I can't speak for every community, but I can speak about my own. When I grew up, the story that I heard about my holy prophet, peace and blessings be on him, was not one that I could relate to. I didn't look at him as a human being. And it's ironic because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Holy Quran, Surah Al-Mu'minun, the chief of unbelievers says to the prophets, how can I take these people as my prophets? They sleep just like I sleep and they drink just like I drink. So the first thing I talked about was age. The second thing I talked about was role models. Role models are critical. Number three is related to this. Remember when I talked about my Sunday school? What is Hajj? How to perform Tawaf? I learned that. What is Salah? How to perform Salah? I learned that. What is Zakah? How to calculate Zakah? I learned that. But nobody ever told me why. As it turns out, for kids growing up as a religious minority, understanding why you believe and what you believe is really important. This idea of critical literacy and critical thinking is embedded into, identity construction. So the idea is that, as a parent, I can't tell my kid, like, hey, this is what you must believe, or this is, who you must be. It must be something that they individually construct on their own. And critical thinking is a key part of that. When I was a kid, and I would go to my dad, and I'd ask questions like, Dad, how do we know that the afterlife is real? Or, Dad, how do we know that there is a day of judgment? My dad would tell me, Amin, these are silly questions. Now, the reality is, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless my dad. He's a wonderful guy, and he's my best friend. And if it weren't for him, I wouldn't be here today. So, I give a lot of respect to my dad. But the reality is that my dad, in saying those things, it wasn't that they were silly questions. It was that my dad didn't know the answer himself. And so realize that as parents, there is a right and a wrong way to answer some of these questions. And obviously there's an adab and there's a respect to the questions as well. But we should help our children seek out these types of answers and use critical thinking such that they actually believe in what they believe. I'll tell you, one of my teachers says, Amin, could you imagine if the noble companions didn't critically think about faith? Where would our faith be today? So critical thinking obviously is very important. So first I talked about age. Second, I talked about role models. Number 3, I talked about critical thinking. Number 4, and we can perhaps talk about this in the Q&A if there are specific questions about it as well, is around what it's called communities of practice. Communities of practice can be defined as, your Islamic center, your community. It's also the friends you're around and parents as well. In order for kids to develop a strong sense of self and who they are, being immersed in communities of practice is very important. I won't touch on it a whole lot. I think that this is something that perhaps is self-explanatory, but we can talk about it further as well. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly, is this last point. The main character in the story of my life that I shared with you was not me. The protagonist in the story of my life wasn't me. No, it was actually my dad. My story started with my dad. As parents, realize that you are actually the main character in the story of your child's life. Now, there was research that was done around this idea of self-concept, this idea of, how do people sort of build an understanding of who they are. And this research was done in the US, is replicated in Canada and Europe and Africa and Southeast Asia, and it discovered that one of the most important variables that affects a child's understanding of who they are is actually the relationship that they have with their mom and dad. It turns out it's not rocket science. It's actually quite simple. Yes, is my video on? I think it should be on. Okay, sorry. Yeah, so it turns out that that this relationship with parents is super important. I mean, so much so that, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says so many times, through hadith and also through, the Holy Quran, that this relationship with parents is important. It's not just something that as kids you have to be, good with your parents. No, parents, that relationship with kids is just so important. So what I talked about today was 5 things. The first related to the idea of age. Ages of 3 to 8. Number 2, I talked about role models. This idea of helping make our the stories of our prophets and things relatable to our kids. Number 3, I talked about critical thinking. Number 4, I talked about communities of practice. And number 5, I talked about parent engagement. And inshallah, I'll reserve the rest of my time for the Q&A. I wanted to end with a couple of quick things. Number 1 is that, yes, we are growing up in a tough time. CARE in California reports that 1 in 2 children in middle school are bullied every single year because of their faith. And realize California is like the most liberal state in the union, so I don't know what that number is in Texas or Tennessee or something like that. But the fact is, it is a tough time. We have a Republican frontrunner who says that we should have ideology tests for Muslims that come to America. We should ban Muslims from entering our country. Yes, it is a tough time. But we must also realize that in this tough time, we have an opportunity to aspire towards something incredible. Only 50 years ago in the United States of America, black and white Americans were not seated at the same table, yet today we have a black president. So Muslims will overcome. This is something that we will, overcome. My theory of change, my belief, though, is that it starts at home, and it starts with a parent's relationship with their kids. Jazakallah khair, and I'll go on mute, and inshallah we will talk more during Q&A.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you so much. I mean, that was a very inspiring story. It was really, really interesting to hear your insights, and just thank you so much for sharing your struggles and the stories about your parents. I think one of the things that really stuck with me was the story about your friend who kind of, after making some comment, said something like, "I didn't realize you were that Muslim anyway," and how that can be such a shocking thing, especially when your self-perception maybe isn't so separated. You might not have this kind of cognitive dissonance about your own identity, but other people see you one way or another way, and not the integrated way that you might see yourself. And to have that reflection from your friend is really interesting. Another thing that really moved me was your last point. I even tweeted it, which was, the point where you said the main character in my story wasn't even myself, it was my father. And the fact, bringing that to light and highlighting that really was quite interesting, and really does put a focus on the fact that parenting does matter, and the questions that, and how you answer your questions, how you answer the questions your children have is really, really interesting. So thank you so much for that. Inshallah, I will quickly introduce Madiha. So really quickly, she was able to join us. So Dr. Madiha Tahseen received her doctorate in applied developmental psychology at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. She received her master's in developmental psychology and also her BA in psychology from the University of Maryland, College Park. She's currently a postdoctoral researcher at UMBC, conducting mixed method research studies on the experience of Muslim American youth. She's also a research fellow with FYI, which is a really great advantage for us. And she's working on developing research related to parenting and identity among Muslim youth. She's also an executive board member of the nonprofit organization called Stones to Bridges, and you can find more about them, stonestobridges.org, which aims to provide an anonymous online platform for Muslim youth to address their emotional, social, and behavioral needs. Madiha's dissertation was on the identity experience of Muslim American adolescents living in a heated socio-political context. And so she brings a wealth of experience and research, and inshallah her presentation will be well received. We're excited to have you joining us. So I'll pass it on over to you, inshallah. Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Okay. Jazakallah khair for this opportunity and for joining us. I do hope to convey a lot of good information in a way that kind of does make sense. Inshallah, I'll start off a little bit just talking about what I plan to talk about, and then I'll walk you through a presentation because I'm a visual person. I think that it helps to see things instead of only just hearing them. Amin kind of already set the stage for what children are experiencing sort of from a younger age. I'm living in sort of the heated context of the political scene in America. So I'll be kind of talking about that, but moving more into the teenage years and for older youth and what they're going through So this is going to be more relevant if you do have older youth starting from middle school and onwards. I'll talk about some of my research about what it really means for our youth and what parents can do about it and what you guys can do about it as you're trying to help them through this really tough time in their lives. I will try not to be redundant with what Amin said, so I do apologize for that in advance, and I'll share my presentation now. Sorry, just pulling up my presentation. Okay. Sorry, just confirmation that it's good before I start.
Yep, it's working.
Okay, sorry. Okay, so who am I and what is identity? I'm hoping to kind of use this picture to talk about what Muslim youth go through throughout this picture. So what is identity? Again, some of this is going to be a little bit repetitive with Amin, so I'll go through it kind of quickly. The official definition, identity is the result of a collective process. It is not a set, concrete identity, but is flexible and can change based on the environment, context, and expectations from things around us. In basic terms, we don't live in a bubble, right? Our identity comes from our constant interaction with the people around us, the environments around us, the groups around us, and everything else that's in our lives. At the heart of it all, as Amin kind of already talked about, is our self-concept, right? It's who you think you are. It's that voice in your head, you know, what you believe in, all of that about yourself. That's at the heart of everything. And over time, that interacts with things around you, other social identities around you, to really eventually turn into identity. And then there's three ways that we can really think about identity. There's individual identity, and so that's how you think about yourself. You know, if I tell you, tell me what you are, and I say I am, whatever you come up with, that's your individual identity. So I am nice, or I am caring, I am smart, things like that. And these are characteristics that are created over time throughout your experiences with everybody and the things around you. Another way that our identity kind of comes to be is also with the roles that are in our lives, right? So those are roles that can be, that we take on, that are ascribed, and so things like I'm a teacher, or like the picture of the girls and that you see, I'm a sibling. Those are things that I chose to be. I am, you know, X, Y, Z. Then there's also roles that are assigned to us by the society and culture around us. And that's kind of where I think a lot of our Muslims are going through right now, is what do they hear in society and around us, and how much do they think that that's what they are? And I think Amin alluded to this a little bit. I just wanted to give you a quick example. So this is a quote or a story from Basil, who's 15 years old, and he was in a research study, and so it was like a group discussion, and he was asked, you know, what people around him are thinking, and he attends a very diverse middle-class public high school, but he still says, you know, I know you're thinking I may be a terrorist. And so the researcher in the show asks, well, how do you know? And he says, I know. I just constantly feel violated, even if they say nothing. So that idea that he thinks he's a terrorist, that's a role that he might be ascribing to himself, unfortunately, because of the environment around him. And then kind of the third way, and I think this is kind of where I will spend a lot of my time talking, is a third way that we kind of think about our identity is based on the groups in our lives, right? So the groups that we belong to, what groups we think we are a part of and that we fit in with, and then on the other hand, groups that we don't think we belong to, and we're very clear about, well, I'm not those kind of people. I'm not like them. I don't do things like that. And so the way we think about those things also forms a big part of identity. Another aspect of groups is also our sense of belonging, right? How attached you feel to that group. So you could think that you are a member of a group, for example, you could think you're Muslim, but it might not be something that gives you a lot of pride. And so you don't really have a strong sense of belonging to that group. And so those two types of differences can really make an impact on how you end up developing your outcomes. And this part of identity is what's really developing for our teenagers once they start hitting middle school and high school. So as Amin kind of talked about before, you know, elementary school and the younger ages, that's really for kids to kind of really form a safe and secure foundation with their family and to really get that sense of security and trust that things are going to be okay. And then as they hit adolescence and they start becoming more independent and exploring, now they're looking to see, well, I know I'm a safe person and I'm good in my life. Well, what do I belong to? Who do I want to be? And this is kind of, these are the kinds of questions they go through when they're trying to figure out their identity based on the groups in their lives. So that's all lovely. What does that mean for us as parents, right? As parents, we're very worried about our kids, especially in the current political climate, and we just want the best for them. So I conducted some research for my dissertation to try to answer this question about where are Muslim youth now, what identities do they have, and what helps them through that process. I wanted to see different ways that our youth kind of think about themselves and what's important to them. So just a clarification, I wasn't looking to see how religious they are or how not religious they are. I wasn't looking to see how much they pray or how much they don't pray, you know, how good of a Muslim they think they are. My questions were more about, is this important to you? Is this an important, being Muslim an important part of who you are? Is being American an important part of who you are? Do you feel very connected to the Muslims around you? Do you feel very connected to the Americans around you? Questions like that. I just wanted to make that very clear. And what we found was that our youth in our sample, limited to my sample, showed 6 different kinds of identity styles. Most of our youth had pretty high Muslim identities, and those that had high Muslim identities, those 3 styles, kind of were different on their American identity. So some were high Muslim and high American, which means that they, you know, really value being both Muslim and American. Both of them were both being Muslim and American was a really important part of who they are, and it made them feel good, and they felt very connected to being Muslim and American. And a great example of this is the picture that you see on your screen with Intitled Chapter. In that image, you can very clearly see she's very proud of her American background, and that's reflected by the flag and the fact that she's, you know, representing the American team at the Olympics. And she's also very proud of being a Muslim. You can see throughout her actions, you know, when she made dua, when she lost, or when she made sujood, or when she talks about being Muslim, she's very proud of being Muslim. It's a very important part of who she is. So when you're thinking about your children and your teenagers, you could think along these lines. Is my child sort of like a high Muslim, high American, or are they kind of another variation? We also had some youth who were high Muslim and very low American. And so it kind of varies differently. The other one style that I kind of wanted to highlight was we also found some youth that were kind of moderate on both identities. So they were just kind of figuring out what they are. In identity terms, we would call them diffuse teens, but they valued being Muslim, but it wasn't really very central to them. It's not the only way they thought about themselves. They kind of only felt sort of moderately connected to the Muslim community. And the same thing about being American. Being American was important to them, but they haven't yet really figured out what it means to them and how they would connect to it. An example of this might be when when you're at the masjid and you see some youth that kind of show up infrequently. They come to some events, not on a consistent basis. They're how they talk about being Muslim. Some days they're kind of very happy about it, but some days they're very frustrated about being Muslim. And the same thing with being American. Sometimes they might think about their ethnicity more, and some days they really do focus on being American. So they're just kind of still exploring, and they really don't understand or haven't quite yet figured out where they kind of stand with both of these identities. And so a lot of people, we talk about these types of teenagers as like an identity in crisis. They haven't quite figured out what it means for them. And so the next thing we kind of wanted to see was, well, we found that there are lots of different kinds of identities. Muslim youth aren't just the way we thought, where like either you're Muslim or you're American, that there's this clash that happens. Our research, very briefly as I talked about it, kind of just shows that they really balance these in lots of different ways, in 6 different ways in my research specifically. So, and we know that identity formation happens with interaction between ourselves and everything around us. So we looked into one of those environments, which was parents. We wanted to see, well, where can we intervene as parents, and what role are parents playing in these different identity styles that we talked about. So we found that integrated youth, or the style that I just talked about, high Muslim and high American, these are the youth like Ibtihaj Muhammad, who are kind of very solid in both identities. They reported the highest level of well-being, which means they also were doing better than all of the other youth in our study. And so we wanted to look at why, and one of the things we looked at was parenting, and we found that they reported their moms, and I'm saying moms specifically because we only had moms in our sample, but we could generalize this to both parents. They reported their parents as being really high on autonomy supportive parenting, and what that really just means is that they really encourage their children to be very self-sufficient by really providing opportunities to internalize the message that new parents are trying to deliver. These are parents that really want their children to understand the value behind why we do things. It's not this idea of you just have to listen because you just have to do it because I told you to do it. It's let me explain the reasoning to you when you're trying to make decisions. Let me help you understand the logic behind those decisions. And it's those kinds of parents that had Muslim youth with these high identities who were doing better. So how can we use this information to help our youth and help our youth that we think might be struggling and aren't doing so well? The first thing that we can do is really listen to your kids as they talk about their struggles and practicing Islam with you, without kind of any judgment or without really jumping in to correct them. I'm sure all of the time you hear your parents say, well, I don't want to, you hear your kids say, I don't want to pray right now, or why do we have to wear hijab? Or like Amin was talking about, why do we believe in the afterlife? They are struggling to practice their deen because they're not grown up yet. It's a process for them. And so you have to let them go through that process and help them through that struggle. I can say that I started wearing the hijab when I was 10 years old. Did I tell you why at that point? Probably not. Definitely not. I definitely didn't learn the real beauty behind why I wear the hijab until in my early 20s. And I'm still learning it now. And part of that is because I, at that point, didn't internalize why it is I wear what I wear or the rituals. A lot of times we teach our children the different rituals about Islam, but we don't show the beauty or logic behind it. So if you try to discuss, your child comes to you and says, well, why do we have to pray 5 times? Why can't we just pray 1 time? Or, being Muslim is so hard. Instead of just wanting to negatively react and have that internal worry, like, oh my God, my kid's, is gonna leave Islam, or Allah's gonna be so mad at him. You have to kind of calm that down inside of you and really talk through those religious values with your children on a daily basis to really help them strengthen why they believe what they believe, so that even when you're not there, that Muslim identity will still be strong for them. And so that when Muslim youth are in high school settings and they're going to be very challenged with lots of different environments and settings that are not very Muslim at all, if they've internalized it through this way, you'll feel very confident that they'll follow what the right thing is, even when you're not there, even when there are situations of a lot of pressure. So another thing to do is to really create opportunities for them to voice any questions that they have about their own faith and really support them as they search for those answers. All of our youth are going to be going through tremendous amounts of questions that they'll face by everybody around them. And sometimes it's very innocent questions like their friends who just are really trying to understand Islam, and sometimes it's not. They'll be asked questions like, well, why do you believe, does your religion oppress women? Why do you believe that there is a hellfire? Why do people need to be punished? And if they're not able to answer those questions, then they will start floundering and figuring that out for themselves. So if you're able to support them as they search for those answers, they'll also be able to better answer those questions and also really internalize the message behind them. Sorry, I'm just wondering if you guys can hear me. Okay.
Yep, we can, no problem.
It's fine now. Okay, sorry. Okay. And so I wanted to give you an example. Sarah Abu mentioned earlier about Stones to Bridges when she was talking about my bio. So Stones to Bridges is a nonprofit organization, and one of the services that we have, it's an online platform. One of the services we have is called Dear Fatima, where users all of our Muslim youth can anonymously submit a question, and it gets answered by one of our licensed counselors, which we call Fatima. But we do have male counselors as well. So this was a question that came through, and I thought it really showed a good example of how youth are questioning why they believe what they believe, and how it might really get you kind of riled up and you're worried as a parent when you read this question. So I'm just going to read it out loud really quickly, but it's also on the screen Hello, I'm 14, male, and I'm half Arab and half American. I always loved Islam and I always wanted to be close to Allah, but one of my problems is I'm seriously attracted to the girls in my class. And to make matters worse, I think they are into me. I mean, it's so hard to say no when a girl asks me out. I just don't know what to do. I think I'm seriously considering having sex, but it seems like everyone is doing it. I know it's very haram, but it's like my soul believes in Allah, but my brain and body don't. Just please help me and tell me what I'm supposed to do before I go home, before I go and become a hypocrite. So the part that I highlighted in bold, I think, really shows how, he has this internal struggle that's going on, and how a parent reacts to that struggle is what will really help him as he's coming out of this situation. So, a mother might think of, or a dad, let's say, hears that question, is going to, freak out and think, oh my God, he's going to commit zina and he's going to be, banned for hellfire. What are we going to do? He has to know that this is wrong. Why doesn't he just understand how wrong this is for him? But, I mean, he's telling you, read the bold part again. I know it's haram, but my soul believes in Allah, but my brain and body don't. And as we know, teens are going through a lot of sort of biological changes, and their their ability to control their emotions hasn't quite caught up yet. So even though cognitively they know something is wrong, they can't control their emotions quickly enough or strongly enough, or not always, can they control their emotions enough to kind of dampen down the emotions part of them and listen to the logic. So what can a parent do in this situation, right? Really bring in those listening skills and try to understand what this boy is going through, and help him see sort of the logic behind it, and also probably offer some alternative solutions to really help them deal with that emotional control, because it's not just about logic. And just as an FYI, a lot of times law therapists will tell Muslim youth to really engage in very heavy exercise 3 times a week, and that helps curb those sexual desires. So I just wanted to give a kind of a live example to show you that when you have youth who are struggling with their Muslim identity, how listening as a parent and kind of guiding through these questions that they're asking instead of freaking out will really help open that dialogue that they're having with you and strengthen their identity, which is in the end what we want. So another quick, and I think I really went into this a little bit already, but another quick do that you should be doing with your children so that they can have strong Muslim and American identities is really provide them with positive experiences with their religious community, because we know that Muslim identity is so important for them. And really help them navigate and cope with any negative experiences that they may have within Muslim communities. This is a quote that you'll see on the screen from a research study in which some youth were when they're talking about their experiences with discrimination and hate that they have, and bullying that they've experienced in schools. One participant said, I don't really tell my parents. They have enough to contend with. And another boy in that group added, I tell nobody because I don't want to upset my parents. They have too much to deal with. And if I tell my teachers, I can get in big trouble. So I just work it out myself. So can you imagine what this child is, what this teenager is going through? They're dealing with these struggles. They've had this bad experience related to being Muslim, and they don't feel comfortable talking about it with their parents. And this is exactly where you don't want our teens to end up. And so the way you can do that is every time your child opens up to you about anything negative that happens to them in a Muslim setting, you really have to work through with them. You could have weekly sessions, kind of impromptu discussions with them. You can give them examples of your own personal life of what's helped. And really it's just about listening. It's not a lot about talking and imposing your experiences onto them. It's really just about listening and helping them come to a point where they realize themselves, whatever the lesson is. For the importance about forming positive experiences with religious communities, it goes back to what we were talking about before, about having a sense of belonging to a group, right? So it's not just about being Muslim. You could talk to your kids about being Muslim day and night all you want to, but until they have a positive sense of belonging with being Muslim, their well-being really doesn't show improvement, according to our research. So to do that, you really have to set up positive activities for them about related to the masjid, but even just outside of the masjid, have events where they're around other Muslims and it's a positive experience for them. And if you do have a negative experience, let's say you're part of an ethnic group that experiences discrimination within our Muslim communities, and which is what Amin was talking about before, talking through that experience and helping them kind of connect that back will help them learn through these experiences in a way that forms their identity over time. And sort of the last parenting strategy that I think would be very helpful is about American identity. So as I said, one of the things that we found was that a lot of our youth didn't report low American identity. They did report that being American was important to them, and that they were just trying to figure out kind of how it fits in and how it blends with being Muslim. So one of the ways that we can do, help our youth in this is by supporting their attempts at being a Muslim in America and what that means. And so some of the different ways to do that is, we can compare and contrast cultural practices of Muslims around the world. You can talk about how being Muslim is different and within different communities, and that's okay. Having that sort of discussion of diversity on a daily basis and just regular conversations will help. And it will also help to kind of bridge the barriers that we have within the different ethnic groups in our Muslim community. So, a lot of times there's a lot of tension between, for example, African American Muslims and convert Muslims and, South Asian Muslims and Arab Muslims within our communities. And so one of the ways to really eliminate that is to have that conversation starting, within your home and with your teenagers. And that will help our Muslim teenagers see that in America, being a Muslim is not this image that we're stereotypically used to, and that it looks different and is very different. And in America, it can be different as well. And another way is to really encourage and support your children's participation in healthy and acceptable American cultural practices to really help them have like an American Muslim culture. And I know a lot of parents kind of freak out when they hear this, but it's totally okay, and we should support our Muslim teenagers having friends that are not Muslim. Most of my friends growing up were actually not Muslim, and they were better for me and a more positive influence in my life than the Muslims that I was associating with. So supporting those friendships will be very important for your teenager to see that they can, have people outside of their circle, and it's okay, and that will help them understand how to have peer acceptance and how to be a Muslim within America in their peer circles, instead of kind of being socially awkward and always being like around police, which a lot of our youth kind of tend doing. Also really encouraging and attending extracurricular activities. When I was growing up, my youngest brother was a stereotypical jock. He was on the football team, both varsity and junior varsity, in his high school. And even though my mom, was an immigrant and wears traditional clothing, she showed up at every single one of his games. We were always there in a very, very in a community that was not diverse at all. We were probably one of the few South Asian people there. But it showed my brother that he can be a football player, but he can also be, and he can still maintain his Muslim practices. There's lots of examples of Muslim athletes in pro sports, and Hakeem Olajuwon, the Hussein brothers, the Abdullah brothers, the Hajj Muhammad just recently. So being aware and talking about those kinds of examples and those role models that Amin was talking about will really help your kids and your teenagers see that, hey, you can be these other roles in American culture and still be Muslim, and that there isn't a clash between them. And the last don't that I just kind of want to really quickly mention was just don't show disapproval when they do talk about different aspects of American culture, American identity that doesn't feel okay to you. And parents, a lot of times we do this kind of unconsciously, right? So if they do something that we don't like, or they're wearing a certain outfit, and we're like, oh, that's so American, or that's so modern, that's not who we are, and just very subtle words like that can really send a message to your child. Well, okay, if my mom thinks this is American, and she doesn't want to see what I really do in school, or what I'm really talking about with my parents. Oh, I can't say this word at home, that's too American, or that's too taboo. So just being aware of those kinds of shows of disapproval will also help our youth really kind of appreciate being American, being a Muslim in America, and how to kind of go on that path with their parents. And so in the picture, as you can see, if it means playing video games with your child for a little bit, hey, let's play some video games. You'll be amazed at how much my 5-year-old tells me when I'm playing games with him. And so it'll be, inshallah, that much more when it's your youth playing with you, inshallah. And so the last thing I just want to kind of mention was that there are a lot of parent resources. I kind of presented a very brief window into a lot of the research that's out there. So FYI is really trying to provide a lot of parent resources for you. They are daily email, Facebook, and Twitter daily posts that are educating everyone about mental illness, promoting your own health and relationships. So it's a lot of bite-sized practical knowledge that's there to empower you. If you feel like there's a very specific topic that you'd like to be addressed, just send us an email on that about that information, and we'll try to find a resource for you, inshallah. We're also sharing a lot of our research findings through infographics, as Sarah mentioned, to really educate everybody in the community on topics that are specific to the Muslim community, inshallah. So I think with that, I'll end, and Jazakallah khair, and I hope that the presentation was useful, inshallah.
Thank you so much, Madiha. That was very interesting and very useful, and I'm hopeful that people found a lot of your points meaningful and useful for them and their in their parenting. A couple things I wanted to just highlight. Very interesting note that the research that you found showed that there really wasn't this dichotomy of identities, and there was actually more of a fusion. And also it was a really good reminder, I think, for us all, but parents in particular, that it's more about listening rather than responding immediately, which I think can be a very hard thing for parents who, you see a problem and you want to fix it, or you kind of want to stop the the gushing pain, and wound, rather than just sit back and listen and actually take it in and figure out what the problem is. And I think that was really highlighted in that example you gave from Stones to Bridges, where the kid, even in his writing, he was like, here's my problem. And then he kind of got to the issue where it was like, a parent might have stopped the kid, the first sentence of that example, when he said, I'm having this problem with girls, and they would have been like, well, here's what we got to do. Instead, like, if you let him listen, you'll hear the rest of his story, which is like, I'm really struggling with this. I know what's haram. I have that kind of understanding. And so if a parent actually is able to take that time and listen, and I think what you called it was autonomy supportive parenting, and I'm sure that takes a lot of practice as a parent, and that is a lot easier said than done. And so I kind of wanted to start off the questions with that, and if both of you could think of kind of more examples of what autonomy supportive parenting looks like, and maybe perhaps in less of a crisis situation, but what does autonomy supportive parenting look like in in an afternoon, and if either one of you can take that, I'll pass on the mic to you.
I'll jump in, and I'll attempt to answer the question, but I also wanted to share a couple of things. SubhanAllah, Sister Madiha, or Dr. Madiha, really appreciated your research, and there's a lot of things that were actually sort of in parallel with our findings. Just wanted to quickly share. So we essentially replicated, if you recall in the conversation that I started with, I talked about the sort of Barbie doll experiment. We replicated that experiment with San Francisco State University earlier this year, and inshallah, the research is in the process of being published. But we worked with younger kids, ages 5 to 9 years old. Half the kids went to full-time Islamic school, half the kids went to full-time public school. It was a really diverse sample. We found three sort of key, there was a host of things that we found, but with respect to this webinar, the three things that I thought were really interesting was, one, first, this idea of internalized oppression, so like our kids, feeling, weird about being Muslim or something like that. Between the ages of 5 and 9, we found that 1 in 3 children don't tell other people that they were Muslim. So they're sort of aware of the fact that being Muslim is a little bit weird or something to that effect. 15% of the kids actively pretended not to be Muslim. But most importantly, and I think what really aligned very well with what Sister Madiha said, was when asked a question, I am American, or when asked to agree or disagree to the statement I am American or the statement Muslims are American, 50% of the respondents between the ages of 5 and 9 said no, I am not an American. And so, when you talked about this idea of Americanness, I think that is something to sort of double-click, highlight, bold, and italicize. I think that as a area of opportunity, that is absolutely something that we saw as well. And what I would add to that is saying, well, why does this matter? Lots of times parents are like, oh, well, our kids are Muslim. That's what matters. They're not American. That's okay. It does matter, right? It matters because of belonging. And again, when we unpack that word belonging, what does that actually mean, right? So one of the ways to think about it is think about your local masjid or your local, I think the masjid is probably a good example. If you feel like you belong at your local masjid, what does that mean? That means you're going to volunteer at your masjid. You're going to fold up the chairs afterwards. You're going to play a role when the guest speaker comes. You're going to, care about whether the lawn is well kept, whether there's a guest speaker coming, something like that. If you feel like you belong to the masjid, you're going to be active. You're going to participate. You're going to feel good about it. If you don't feel like you belong, then you likely will come and go for Jummah prayers, and that's basically it. In the same way, if our kids don't feel like they belong in America, that's going to affect a whole host of things. So anyways, that was one of the things I wanted to highlight. And then number two, this idea of role models and friends, and Sister Madiha talked about the role of non-Muslim friends. Recall in my conversation I talked about role models. As it turns out, just as important as it is to have Muslim role models, kids have to have sort of ally role models as well. That is, when they see a non-Muslim that actually supports Muslims. So for example, last year, I think it was last year, or maybe it was earlier this year, I don't recall, President Obama gave a speech at a masjid. And at that masjid, he talked about how Muslims are an integral part of America and how he supports Muslim and how he's a secret Muslim. No, I'm kidding. I don't think he said that. But anyways, that role model, right, of like the President of the United States of America saying, hey, we love you Muslims, that's actually a really big deal for kids to build that self-confidence. And then finally, going back to your question of, okay, so what does supportive parenting look like, / there was a better word that you had used. I want to underscore the idea of parent involvement. Schooling is a key part of our lives as Americans. Schooling is a really, really important place where kids not just learn about math and science, but they learn about how to relate to the world around them. And so what that means is that the more that parents can be involved, the better it is for the kids. And so what I mean by that is when there's a field trip and there's an opportunity for a parent to come as a chaperone, go. When there's an opportunity to be involved in the parent-teacher organization, go to that. If there's like a fundraiser and they're going to be doing baking to raise money or something like that, or whatever, get involved in kids' schools as much as possible. And I will, share one story of what I thought was a really great experience of parenting. There was a student whose hijab was pulled off, and the mom was called. No, the dad was probably called too, but I don't know. The mom answered the phone, I guess. And they said, what do we do to the kid? And the mom said, hey, don't discipline him. Let's actually use this as a teachable moment. And so the mom actually ends up going to school and gives a presentation to all of the faculty about, like, what is Islam, what are the core tenets, and why does hijab matter? That was, like, extraordinary. That was, like, an opportunity where, a parent really decided to, take sort of a tough situation and do something good with it. So a couple of thoughts from Sister Madiha's presentation.
I can still answer. I don't know if you had other questions, Sarah. You were just going to just give a quick example.
No, go ahead.
Okay, so I think if you think about autonomy, supportive parenting, if you think about the usual because I said so, autonomy supportive parenting is the exact opposite of that. So it's when you're, when I was growing up, we, I have a big family, and I have, some cousins that started wearing this scarf. And I don't always like to give the scarf example, but it's just the one that's coming to my mind right now. But essentially, one of them started wearing the scarf, and they, only did it out of pressure because of the people that are around them. I mean, even myself, I put the scarf on also because of, I just had friends around me that were wearing the scarves. And so I also did it, for that same reason. But for this person, she's growing up in more of the current atmosphere. She was younger, and so when she approached her parents about taking the hijab off, which is actually a pretty common phenomenon, unfortunately, nowadays, their parents' response was, well, just wear it until you turn 18, just finish high school, and then you can do whatever you want. So that's not autonomy supportive parenting, right? One, it's failing to understand and acknowledge the underlying issue that this person is having. It's also imposing the decision on her. If she, in Islamic terms, she's baligh, right? She can make her decision whatever she wants. But as a parent, it's our job to guide. And so it's not guiding her to a decision, it's forcing the decision on her by saying, hey, just wear it until you turn 18 and then do whatever you want, whatever significance 18 has. So instead, a better way would be to talk, first you have to calm yourself down. And that's the biggest part of any parenting, is really calming your own emotions and being in a place where you can have a calm, rational conversation with your child or your teenager. So it's calming yourself down and then talking to her and trying to understand. So, instead of saying just wear it, wear it until you turn 18, my question as an autonomy supportive parent, in theory, would be, what is it about wearing the scarf that's bothering you right now? What's going on? What do you think how do you think you will feel if you take it off? Asking questions like that. You're really kind of being a therapist, but in a way you're asking those questions. Those answers that you get will give you insight into what your youth is feeling, and it'll help them give insight into feelings that they may not be able to uncover and think through without your guidance. So when they're able to do that, then they might come to a realization about one way or the other, but it's something that they came to on their own and that you didn't force on them. So I hope that kind of clarifies what autonomy supportive parenting might look like, inshallah.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, both of you, for those examples. I really appreciate them. So I guess I wanted to kind of, both of you, I think, have experience in this area, and I think a lot of our viewers are probably parents and probably working specifically with young people. And so I was wondering if you had any more suggestions, I think, on what individual parents or parent groups could do to support each other in kind of developing this type of parenting, because it isn't something that necessarily will come naturally to everyone. And if there's something, some kind of suggestions or tips that you guys might have for parent support in each other, I'd be happy to hear them.
I had some quick, just really quick before I forget them, and then Amin, I'll pass it on to you, inshallah. So I don't have, my oldest child is 5 years old, but right now we're about to start kindergarten, and so we've got different groups going. And most of the time the purpose of the group is really just to ask like sort of procedural questions like, hey, have you gotten uniforms yet? Or hey, or have you talked to the teacher yet? But we also a lot of times will ask questions about, I think this is going on, or I think this is going on. So having a parent support group where you can just talk to each other about issues that have come up that, my kid came to me the other day and asked me that, they don't understand why they have to pray and I didn't really know what to say, or things like that. Just having that setting to ask kind of informal questions and just kind of have your own support system for your own mental health is really helpful. A lot of times, a lot of masajid have started having like Ummi and Me groups, which is more for, stay-at-home moms that have much younger kids. It's supposed to be like for babies. But I really think that we should have groups like that for our parent support groups for teenagers, for parents of teenagers. We think that, as kids get older, we sort of need to back off, but it's even more of a time to get involved, as Amin was talking about. So having a parent support group for parents of Muslim youth specifically would be really important, and something that our communities should really consider. The last thing I just wanted to say, that it's not just about being able to talk to someone else about, hey, my kid asked me this question, I don't know what to say. A big part of parenting, and probably one of the bigger parts of parenting, is not more about what you can get your teenager to do or what your child to do. It's about how to calm yourself down and how to work on your own emotions and your own mental health. So even just having a support group to go hang out and do things, or ask questions about something that's bothering you for your youth, that would be very helpful as well, inshallah.
So I wanted to comment on a couple of quick things. So first is teachers play a really important role, and I don't mean teachers in the form of, elementary school teachers or high school or middle school teachers, but as parents, the people who we look to as our teachers. Perhaps it's a scholar in our community or other shayukh or other perhaps teachers, but realize that that decision is actually a very, very important decision. If a teacher is a good teacher, that is, I think, a really great starting point. And if you find that that may not be the case, and may, for example, not respond to questions about mental health or things like that, like why is it that that can be sort of a problem? So number one, this idea of figuring out who your teacher is a big deal, and one that I think parents should take very seriously, and also realize that, I mean, subhanAllah, we've had the opportunity to travel in all sorts of, big places and small places. If you're living in a big city, like, for example, Chicago or Dallas or in D.C. or San Francisco or L.A. or something like that, most of these communities have no shortage of wonderful, communities and scholars and things like that to sort of, take advantage of. So realize that, if you get questions from kids and things like that, and you don't know how to deal with it, these resources are sort of available as well, and sometimes we don't think to actually go to them, but realize that exists. Number two, I want to highlight this idea of communities of practice a little bit more. We spent a lot of time talking about parents, and parents obviously matter a lot, but friends, community, play a super important role, especially as kids get older as well. I joke around, in business we have something called the 80-20 rule, so that's 20% of the value contributes to 80% of the success. After a kid becomes like 14 years old, it sort of becomes the 199 rule, where one decision sort of affects 99% of success, and that decision is who your friends are. Now, what I mean by that is when we think about friendship, the goal here isn't to tell our kids who they should be friends with, but instead sort of help them realize that friendship actually matters. So when we go to communities and do an event, oftentimes we'll do an exercise where we say, hey, what are the qualities I should look for in a spouse? And we do this laundry list of qualities of someone who's loyal and trustworthy and has a good character and is cute. No, I'm kidding. That we don't normally say that, but we create this laundry list of characteristics, and then we say, how important is finding someone to get married to, and everyone's like, oh, that's super important. And then we sort of start thinking about how that decision of who our friends are relates to that decision of who we get married to, and quite honestly, we should sort of go through that same process of deciding who our friends are. That's one of the, I think, really important things that, as parents, actually helping children understand that process of making friends, not selecting friends for them, but helping them think through the decision making. I will also just say, with respect to communities of practice, is knowing that if kids are sort of immersed in sort of positive environments, that matters, and Sister Madiha talked about that as well. Finally, the last thing I wanted to say was that I spoke a little bit about role models and things like that. The other day we were at a graduation. It was my wife's graduation, and my sister's baby was there, and she's actually not a baby anymore. She's 5 years old, so she's not a baby anymore. But we were telling Asya, not to play with the phone. We said, Asya, don't play with the phone. We're here. And right after, my dad said, Asya, don't play with the phone, he took out his phone and started checking his email. And it's sort of interesting because, we have to realize that, as parents, like, the role that we can play is literally just as being a role model, by sort of practicing what we preach, that can often speak volumes. And so, in this dialogue of, what good parenting looks like, it's easy to say that parents are a role model, but when practiced, it is often much more challenging than meets the eye. And I encourage, parents to actually think about this. Like, are we actually practicing the types of things that we are hoping to engender in our children in terms of characteristics and things like that?
Thank you guys so much. We went a little bit over, so apologies and thanks to all of those who have stuck on with us. I do want to give just a really quick recap and reminder about the different organizations. So thank you, Amin, specifically from Noor Kids. Please check out their website and perhaps add your name to this list of subscriptions. So it's noorkids.com, noorkids.com. And Madiha with Stones to Bridges, check it out as a parent. I think if you're watching this and you have young kids, it's a great resource to kind of leave lying around, especially if you don't feel as if you're able to have these conversations immediately, or if your relationship's not at the level, but your kid needs help. It's stonestobridges.org, STONESTOBRIDGES.org. And also would also like to draw your attention to the Family and Youth Institute, and that's at www.thefyi.org. As Madiha said, we have lots of resources. We have a daily article that goes out if you sign up on our listserv. Like our Facebook page, we have really great resources that we post on there, such as infographics, announcements for workshops, announcements for webinars, as well as videos that we're posting. And alhamdulillah, finally, before I end, I just wanted to announce that we'll be at ISNA this year. We have 8 different speaking sessions, and the topics range all the way from divorce to pre-marriage, pre-marriage MSA session, as well as youth mentorship, and a brand new fellow with us will be speaking on mental health for community organizers. So we're very excited to be coming to the Chicago area, and inshallah we hope to see some of you there. We'll also be posting this webinar on our Facebook page tomorrow, so if you know of people who might like to use this as a resource, please feel free to pass these along. Jazakallah khair again to our speakers. Really great to have you both, and I know it's a late night, so inshallah we'll log off now. Assalamu alaikum.